Hello, and welcome to Shelf Life from the Virginia Festival of the Book. I'm Jane Kulo, Director of the Virginia Center for the Book, a program of Virginia Humanities. Thanks for joining us. A couple of notes before I hand the program over to our speakers. This event has optional closed captioning, which you can turn on and customize at any time with the closed captions tabs at the bottom of your window. If you haven't already read today's book, we hope you will. For details about how to buy it from a local bookseller or check out a copy from your library, visit vabook.org, where you can also explore the schedule of upcoming programs and watch past events. While you're there, please consider making a donation to support the festival's ongoing work at vabook.org/give. We also thank Ting for supporting our virtual programming. Now I'm pleased to introduce today's speakers. Michelle Nijhuis, author of Beloved Beasts, Fighting for Life in an Age of Extinction, is a project editor at The Atlantic, a contributing editor at High Country News, and an award-winning reporter whose work has been published in National Geographic and the New York Times Magazine. She is co-editor of the Science Writer's Handbook and lives in Washington, and you can learn more at michellenijhuis.com. Oliver Milman is a British journalist and the environment correspondent at The Guardian, US. His forthcoming book, The Insect Crisis, will publish in March 2022. He lives in New York City. Michelle and Oliver, thank you so much for joining us for Shelf Life. Oliver, over to you.
Thank you so much for that, Jane, and welcome everybody to this event. I'm really excited to talk to Michelle about her fantastic book. Beloved Beasts is a cracking read and very colourful and entertaining and informative all at once. So really excited to talk to you today about that, Michelle. As mentioned, I'm the environment correspondent at The Guardian US. I have a book coming out myself early next year on the decline of insects around the world. And some of the themes I touch on this kind of overlap with some of the things that Michelle has brought to life so wonderfully in this book. Michelle, I just wondered, firstly, what was the genesis of this book? What kind of inspired your kind of look at the great kind of conservation figures of history that form this book? What kind of got you into that?
Well, thanks, Oliver, and thanks, Jane, for having me to this great ongoing festival. I have family roots in Virginia, so I'm especially delighted to be here. I often think that if I had known how difficult it was going to be to piece together the story of the modern conservation movement in a book that wasn't 10,000 pages long, I never would have undertaken it, but I'm glad I did. I have covered conservation for a long time as a journalist, and before that I was a biologist. I worked as a field assistant on wildlife research projects, and that work especially brought me in contact with some of these very passionate, even violent debates over endangered species in the US West and all over the world, which continue today. And I was always struck by how out of context those conversations were. You know, it was as if we were arguing really vociferously about whether or not to protect this one species. And it was as if we had never protected a species before. You know, there was no sense of, oh, we have some tools, we know how to do this, we know why we're doing it. And I knew a little bit about the history of conservation just as someone who was interested in it, but I knew about a bunch of individual people. I think like most conservationists, I didn't have a sense of the conservation movement as a tradition that had changed over time. And so over the years, I thought more and more about this, and really, I mean, I looked for a book that did this and could explain the conservation movement to me, and eventually decided I would have to try and do it myself. And I learned a huge amount during the process, and found it really satisfying to try and take stock of what we actually have accomplished over the past century or so, that people have been thinking about conservation on an international level. We've learned, we know what to do, and we've done some things right that we can continue doing.
Wonderful. And the kind of conservation movement kind of sprouted from as you kind of show in your book, quite dark places in terms of where the US got to. I mean, you outline the kind of mass slaughter of bison in the US West, the loss of incredible numbers of birds, for example, for fashions. I mean, I just wondered if you could kind of illustrate a bit about that time and how attitudes shifted, didn't they, among some people around how our relationship with nature, our exploitation of it, whether it should be something that should be managed or conquered or left alone.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, of course, people have been conserving the animals and the habitats and the resources they depend on at a local level for, since the beginning of human history. But at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, people in North America and Europe and other wealthy countries didn't really have a sense of how their societies were affecting the fates of species, not only in their backyards, but around the world, as their empires expanded and their footprint expanded. And in the Christian tradition, because of the Christian tradition, they also didn't have a sense of the reality of extinction. They knew that they could have an impact on the environment, but that the idea that human activities could drive another species extinct, this was just almost unimaginable. People thought, well, species are static creations of God. Yeah, we can cause some damage, but we can't drive a species off the planet forever, especially not a species as numerous as and was physically large as the bison, or as numerous as these beautiful tropical or subtropical birds that were being used as decoration, whose feathers were being used as decoration for hats. And so people really had to be confronted with it in a very dramatic fashion. And it wasn't until the late 1800s when really the population of the North American population of bison, which had been in the millions, there are all kinds of stories about how the herds of bison just darkened the land, and of course had supported many societies for thousands of years. It wasn't until that species was almost extinct due to commercial hunting that a few people stood up and said, look, that not only is this possible, but not only is it possible for the species to go extinct, but it's possible for us to do something about it. And we have to, it's our moral responsibility as a society to do that.
Right.
So, yeah.
And the response of one man in order to highlight this was to actually go out and shoot one of the few remaining bison,
right.
take it back to the East Coast and mount it in order that people could be confronted quite literally with it. I mean, that kind of said a lot, I suppose, about how that was accomplished.
I mean, there's nothing like conservation history to pour on the ironies. But yeah, William Hornaday, who I write about early in the book, was a trophy hunter by profession, and a bit of a showman, but also genuinely passionate about animals. And he had traveled the world as a trophy hunter because at the time zoos were rare, and this was a accepted profession, to go around the world, shoot animals and bring them back to museums for, at the time, what was thought of as the benefit of science. And we can certainly argue about whether or not there was a benefit to that. But when he found out about the plight of the bison, he was like, it was like, if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And he said, well, I'm going to use what I know how to do. I'm going to go out and shoot a few of these bison so that I can show people on the East Coast who have perhaps never seen a bison, but do buy bison hides for rugs. I can show them how incredible this species is. And so, we look back at that now and we think, come on, you shot a couple dozen animals of the species that was almost, that was very close to being wiped off the face of the earth. What were you thinking? On the other hand, millions of people saw this quite artistic bison display. It still exists today. I've seen it. And just thinking back to what it must have been like when when there wasn't high definition video, there weren't incredible color photographs of these, that this was as close as people got in urban America to imagining what a bison must have been like. And I think it did wake people up to a certain extent, because then after that, there was real society-wide concern over the fate of the bison. And because of some of the things that were done after that, we have a fairly healthy population of bison today, and one that's the center of a really exciting, much deeper restoration effort that's happening today and is led by indigenous tribes.
Right. And you touch on it in the book about America's kind of relationship with nature, especially with that kind of westward expansion, the kind of manifest destiny idea of kind of conquest of nature and the peoples who lived in that part of the continent. But that kind of view kind of changed, didn't it? Ideas of kind of what it meant to be American, what it meant to be a kind of tough, rugged, masculine person, I suppose. There were all kinds of ideas tied up in that, wasn't there, in terms of America's view of the environment?
Yeah, the poor bison, we really loaded a lot of ideas on the bison that had nothing to do with the bison as an animal. And, Hornaday and his buddies, including Theodore Roosevelt, who were all, very elite, wealthy sport hunters. They really valued, I think, genuinely appreciated the majesty of these animals, and they gained some spiritual solace from their time in the outdoors, but they also saw it as a way of kind of shoring up their masculinity, which was widely seen as under threat in this time when a lot of men were suddenly spending a lot of time wasting away in offices and losing their muscle tone, and so for them, protecting the bison was really it had very nationalistic overtones, very overtones of protecting their own masculinity and the masculinity of their society. And they really, Hornaday especially, they were very almost willfully ignorant about the cultural role that bison had played for so many societies for so long. And in fact, Hornaday, that even at the time, it was widely recognized that white commercial hunters and not Native Americans had been responsible for the bison decline. But Hornaday continued to insist, oh no, it's been mostly Native Americans who have persecuted this poor creature. And I mentioned that now today the restoration efforts are led mostly by tribes and First Nations, and it's when you talk to people who are involved in that effort, they are certainly very aware of the irony of this earlier generation of conservationists that were protecting the bison for their own reasons, but because of their work made it possible for this much more sort of culturally wise and ecologically aware restoration that's happening today.
Right. And you do explore that difference between what a conservation is and what an environmentalist is, because a lot of us, I think, use those terms interchangeably, but you kind of look at how conservationists kind of focused on one or two kind of species, often using kind of questionable methods to get their populations back up, where kind of environmentalism, ecology, this more kind of holistic view then started to kind of develop after that, didn't it? And I guess that's still developing now. We're still in that kind of process of grappling with the natural world and how it all interacts with each other.
Yeah, and I mean, I often use the terms conservationist and environmentalist interchangeably too. Most people think of them as it's a general concern for other species, but they do historically have very different origins. The environmental movement was much more sort of grew out of an urban hygiene movement, a concern about water quality and air quality in cities. And while the conservation movement, as I said, was founded by mostly, elite hunters and sportsmen, and those movements have come together and I think learned from each other, because the conservation movement has brought this sense that, I think the strength of the conservation movement is that it recognizes the importance of human relationships with the natural world. There is, yes, we appreciate animals, other species for their ecological value, but we also appreciate them for their practical value. We're animals too, and we depend on animals and water and healthy forests for survival. And So I think that's the strength of the conservation movement. And then the environmental movement has brought in a much more, it's a bit younger and was much more ecologically informed, informed by the new science of ecology as it was emerging in the mid 20th century and strengthening in the mid 20th century. And so, yeah, those two traditions continue. They continue to sort of conflict with each other and also build on each other's, build on the lessons that each of them has learned over time.
And in the book, you kind of look at a kind of handful of characters that have kind of shaped this evolving understanding of the natural world, and many of them are very kind of charismatic, eccentric, so kind of live these lives of kind of certainly of a kind of bygone age where you could kind of go off and have adventures and everyone would follow them closely, and you could come back and tell the world and about what you did, and that would actually shift public opinion. I mean, it seems like a very kind of bygone age now, doesn't it? But I just wonder how important you feel these individuals are in shifting our understanding and our relationship with the natural world. I mean, were they people who could bend public opinion individually, or were there kind of greater forces underway?
That's an interesting point, isn't it? I mean, gosh, you and I know how, and we experience it every day, how different the media environment is now than what it must have been then. Yeah, William Hornaday could say in the early late 1800s, he could say, "Hey, I've got a new bison exhibit at the American Museum of Natural History. You might want to come see it." And and millions of people would show up because there wasn't a lot of competition. There weren't a lot of other spectacular events going on that were competing for attention. Right. So yeah, in a way, these figures, especially early on, had more command of their audience. But I also tried to pick. I mean, I picked about a dozen people who I felt like had either brought about turning points in the conservation movement or had been present, kind of represented those turning points, and as a way of finding my way through this incredibly far-flung, complicated movement. So they are representative, and there's certainly many people who don't appear in the book. But I mean, so as I said, some of them did, were able to almost single-handedly bring about change. But the thing that I felt that I really learned from the book, learned from the process of researching it, was how closely they all worked together and worked with other conservationists. I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think we all have this sense of, we know about Rachel Carson, maybe we know about Alda Leopold, who wrote a Sand County Almanac. We know about John Muir, having ecstatic moments in the Yosemite. But we don't think of those people as hanging out with each other, collaborating, working with each other. And they did, even the most eccentric geniuses among them were very embedded in their societies, and they learned from each other. They had opinions about each other. And so that was really the probably one of the things that has stuck with me the most from researching the book, was how dependent they all were on allies and on what was happening in their societies at the time.
Yeah, you do a really good job of drawing those links between the different characters, and I kind of learned so much about the relations of Charles Darwin, who was one of the founders of the eugenics movement. I mean, there are all kinds of links that I kind of never quite knew, so it was kind of interesting to kind of draw that out. One character I feel we have to kind of talk about is Rosalee Edge, because she's just fantastic and seems like it would be wonderful to go to dinner with. Can you just explain a bit about her, because she's not as well known as Roosevelt or Rachel Carson, but she had a profound impact, didn't she? And she was kind of operating in a kind of obviously a very different era to now, and had to get things done her own way, didn't she? I was wondering if you could talk a bit about her.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, some of the people, as I said, some of the people in the book are probably well known to most of us, but others are not. And Rosalee Edge is one that I think too few people know about, even though I see her role in the conservation movement as really key. She came to conservation relatively late in her life. She was in her 50s in the 1930s when she became active. And she was a veteran of the suffrage movement. She had been really prominent in the New York State suffrage party and fought for the right to vote. And like so many women who came into public life through the suffrage movement, she then looked around for a new cause, and like some other suffrage veterans, got into the conservation movement. And she became a birder in New York in the 1920s and in Central Park, and through that kind of tight-knit society of bird fans, she learned that the Audubon Society was not sticking up for birds of prey. And she didn't have an education in ecology, but she was very sharp, and she immediately recognized that this was ridiculous. You can't just pick out your favorite species and protect them. You're protecting, I mean, maybe you do, but you are protecting, you're not just protecting species in isolation, you are protecting all species because you know that they have relationships with each other. And the fact that the Audubon Society was kind of allowing people to hunt or not pushing back when Alaska, for instance, was paying bounties for people to shoot bald eagles because birds of prey were considered pests by many people at the time. She thought this was just crazy, and she was very outspoken. She took the sort of stuffy members of the National Audubon Board to task, and eventually shamed them into taking a much broader view of species conservation. And really, I think, just really shifted the movement from this is a movement for protecting species we like because we think they're beautiful or we think they're useful, to this, we're trying to protect all life because we think it's important. We think we may not know exactly why it's important, but it's important in some way.
And I mean, there were kind of 50, 60 years between them, but both her and Carson were kind of told to pipe down a bit, weren't they?
Oh, goodness, yeah.
By men, basically. I mean, I suppose that was a kind of ongoing issue then, and I'm sure to a lesser degree now.
Yes, yeah, like Kamala Harris, they had to say, "I'm speaking," and nevertheless, they persisted. And I think they both faced that. Rachel Carson, especially if you read some of the contemporary press coverage of Silent Spring, it's just drips with condescension. This hysterical woman who's so concerned about pesticides, she must be just not quite right in the head. When really, I mean, the irony is that Rachel Carson was, her accomplishment was to beautifully draw together other people's research. This was not her own science. She built a case for how dangerous DDT was based on the science that was out there. So she was bringing attention to work that was already in existence.
And Kennedy referenced her book and said that they would look into the issue, which again seems like a bygone age in terms of the media's influence or the influence of literature or single figures to actually shape policy in that way. I mean, her book was kind of anticipated, wasn't it, by the Kennedy administration before it even come out?
Yes, I mean, talk about, as fellow authors, we can certainly appreciate that, we would all love for our sweat and tears to have the impact that Rachel Carson's book had, because Kennedy was aware of it before it came out. He had read her previous work. He was a fan he was a sailor, so he loved the sea around us. And he, at a press conference after it had been published, the book had been published in the New Yorker before it was published as a book, and he acknowledged that, quote unquote, Miss Carson's book was something that the administration was taking very seriously. And yeah, it's true. It's very hard for a single person's work to break through like that. But I take heart from those examples because I feel that, the press not that the press has any agenda, much as, people love to, I only wish we were so coordinated as to have a single agenda. That would be, a miracle. But I feel that, the press over decades has done a better and better job of covering climate change, for instance. And we are now seeing, now I think we just see a much wider understanding in society of the stakes. So I think it's rare for a single person to have that kind of impact, but I think we together, we can still break through.
Sure. If anyone who wants to ask any questions of Michelle, please do so. I do want to ask you a couple of more things, though. One thing was to touch on the kind of elephant that stalks the whole book, which is the racism of many of these characters. Obviously, that was kind of bound up in a lot of things in terms of relationship with the land, relationship with Native Americans, and so on. But they do all seem to have, to some degree, very problematic views. I would just wonder if that was a kind of feature of the time or a bug.
Yeah, great question. I think, again, like most people interested in conservation, I had a sense when I started this book that there were people in the conservation pantheon, so to speak, who had said and done things that we now consider reprehensible, or even things that were considered reprehensible at the time. But it wasn't. As I researched the book, I realized that, and I would never want to imply that conservation as an enterprise is inherently racist in any way. Nothing could be further from the truth. Yeah, but for some reason, throughout the history of the modern conservation movement, in every generation, there have been a minority of people who have been attracted to conservation. They've conflated their interest in conservation and in what they see as the purity of other species with the purity of what they think of as their own race, and they have espoused these views that are something more than just the contextual attitudes of the time. And it really, I think it's something that it's really important for modern conservationists to look at, because I think that racism and elitism, the way it's added up over time is in this real dismissal and blindness to ordinary people's ability to take care of the species they live alongside. And that became especially destructive and counterproductive when the conservation movement went international and started to operate in colonial territory. There was this attitude of, well, we just need to draw boundaries around these amazing species so that, the clueless local people won't harm them. And when in fact, the so-called clueless local people had been caring for these species for millennia in many cases, very responsibly. And the effect in many cases of these colonial parks was to displace people and disrupt those quite sustainable relationships that had existed for a long time. And I think in recent generations, conservation, the international conservation movement has really recognized this oversight and has become, there's much more emphasis now on community-led conservation and supporting community-led conservation, and making connections among communities that are doing things at a local level. But that legacy is there. And I think, we shouldn't be afraid of it. We should just look at it. And I mean, I found it, after knowing about it for a long time and feeling confused about it, I found it quite helpful to look straight at it for a couple of years and think about why it existed and think about what we should do about it and how it could be how that legacy, could be overcome. So, so my goal was to write a constructively critical history.
Yes.
I think the conservation movement has done some really important work by making it possible for us to work across borders as conservationists, but they have had they still do have some systemic blind spots and systemic biases, and if we're going to move forward, we got to look at those.
Right, because I suppose an uncharitable view would be, okay, well, these characters may have saved a few species that they focused upon, but they perpetuated ideas that, you know, had proved harmful until now, and they didn't do enough maybe to tackle some systemic things that harm our environment, around the way we develop land, farming, how we pollute, certainly around fossil fuels nowadays. I mean, would it be fair to criticize these characters for that, or are they very much just products of their time, doing what they could in an imperfect world?
Yeah, well, in some ways, I feel like both are true. You know, they were doing what they could in an imperfect world, and they didn't do enough, and they, you know, they didn't do enough even with what they knew at the time, and they certainly didn't do enough with what we know now. I think that I think what they did has value. I mean, I don't have the ability to weigh one against the other and say, well, did they do more harm than good? I can see that they did good, and I can see that they did some harm, and that there were huge missed opportunities. But I think that moving forward, we can look at what they did, you know, look at some of these institutions that I think are helpful because we do need international institutions that can connect us, because we are a global society in so many other ways. We need global conservation institutions, but we also need this work at the local level. And so I think that marriage of the good and the ignored is the way for the conservation to move forward. And then I think the climate movement is doing some of that systemic work that the conservation movement never really got to. You know, the conservation movement has in many ways still been, you know, it's still facing many of the same threats that it faced 150 years ago: poaching, destruction of habitat, and the root causes of so many of those things are the root causes that the climate movement is now attacking. So I think that there's a great possibility for cooperation, greater cooperation there than there has been.
Right. I was going to ask you about the climate movement now, because that is the kind of all-consuming kind of feature, I suppose, of environment. If we kind of sail past the kind of 70s and 80s and 90s of Greenpeace and the whales and Sting campaigning in the Amazon, we're going to get to we get to
do a montage.
climate. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's a montage moment, which obviously important kind of milestones in the environmental movement, but kind of certainly last decade, the overwhelming focus has been on the climate crisis, hasn't it? Especially as its impacts become more tangible. And I just wonder how you feel the kind of modern environmental movement has subsumed that. I mean, are we now kind of thinking exclusively about climate change and not really about these kind of conservation questions around species and about habitat, and obviously there are overlapping elements of those, but is climate change now the kind of only show in town?
Well, yeah, I mean, in some ways this is a problem of success, in that the climate movement, you know, as I was saying, I think due to the good work of journalists and scientists, that people have become aware of climate change. And there's been, as we all know, this incredible youth movement over the past few years that has really moved climate into people's everyday awareness, along with, you know, the reality of climate change that people are facing. Unfortunately, it becomes unignorable when it really is in your front yard. But I think and so my experience, just in, you know, as I've talked about this book and talked with people about conservation, that many people, even people who were very concerned about conservation, equate climate with conservation. You know, the sort of assumption, unexamined assumption as well, if we solve the climate change problem, which, you know, is a big if, then, you know, we'll have solved conservation. So I think it's worth remembering that many species are threatened, they will be threatened certainly by climate change, but the most immediate threats they're facing are these very familiar threats, unfortunately very familiar threats, like I said, poaching and habitat destruction. So I think it's important, and I'm always so glad that the Guardian has an environment desk that includes climate rather than just a climate desk that sometimes thinks about conservation, because I think we do have to think of these problems as intersecting and not as one can't really take precedence over the other. We need to when we think about climate solutions, we have to make sure that those are not setting us back on the conservation front, because of course, good conservation can further climate mitigation and adaptation in many ways, and we know about those, and so we need to just keep both things in mind as we move forward.
Right. I know, and I mean, in the broad span of things, I suppose in a kind of 150-year period, we've gone from a kind of general reluctance to admit that we can even exterminate a species to now kind of widespread almost panic among a lot of people about climate change, and that certainly younger people, there's a lot of feelings of doom and a concern about whether they should have children and so on. I mean, that's been a huge change, hasn't it, in a relatively short period of time. Our concern about the environment, it's kind of grown hugely, hasn't it?
Yeah. I was talking to a friend who's a longtime career conservationist the other night, and he was saying, 40 years ago when I started this work, my mantra was, it's so much worse than you think. And he said, and now I feel like my mantra has to be, no, wait, there's still hope, so maybe we journalists have overshot a little bit in our messaging, and we do need to say, yes, these threats are huge and existential in many ways, but look at what we have accomplished, and look at what we've, I think maybe even more importantly, look at what we've learned and can still apply. And I know we were talking about this yesterday, but your book is about what I think seems to many people also another kind of existential crisis, the decline in insects. And I think, as you well know, it's important to communicate the gravity of these threats while still pointing out that there are many opportunities, that we still, because I think this sort of panic or apocalyptic mindset can be just as dangerous for all of us as complacency. We can't say, oh, it's so bad that it's hopeless. Yes, we are facing huge losses, we're facing huge threats, but it's not hopeless, because there are opportunities for us to make things better, to reduce the impacts, to restore things. And I think we as journalists have to find ways to tell exciting stories about that. I think the danger for us sometimes is to sort of default to the drama of drama of extinction or drama of apocalypse. And, in the environment we're working in today, when there's so much competition for attention, I can see that, but I think we have to find the drama in the story of, wow, these people, they saw what was coming, and they actually, they protected the place that they live in and depend on, amazing. How can we make those stories stick with people and attract people's interest as well?
Yeah, it's a kind of careful balance, isn't it? Because things are objectively pretty bad, but there are victories, and as your book kind of highlights, there have been victories throughout, the last century or so. It's just that they can be obscured by the other kind of more pressing emergencies it feels upon us. I wonder if you kind of feel that we need a kind of new generation of these figures, or whether we have them. I mean, is Greta Thunberg the new Hornaday? Is Al Gore the Roosevelt, or whatever comparison you'd want to make? I mean, do we have those figures now, and do we need them? I mean, is it even imperative to have these kind of totemic kind of individuals who can affect change themselves, or is it more about building alliances and movements of people?
Yeah.
who then pushed for that change?
Gosh, that's a great question. We could talk about that for hours. Well, I like to think of Greta Thunberg as the new Rosalee Edge.
Right, of course, yeah.
Just
She'd be more Rosalee Edge. You're right.
and
Sorry.
yeah, and just her. I mean, I so admire her moral clarity, her sort of adolescent, but also incredibly wise and mature moral clarity and ability to deliver that. And I think Rosalee Edge, that was her strength, and to some extent Rachel Carson's too, just to cut through the hemming and hawing and say, look, this is wrong. You know, what are we thinking? And to give people that moment of self-awareness that really can affect change. I don't know, it's a hard time for heroes, right? Like, we elevate people and then they seem to almost inevitably disappoint us or disappoint themselves. I'm wary of our tendency to idealize people and load them with impossible expectations and then be surprised when they fall short. So while I think that we always need, the inspiration of charismatic, brilliant people, I hope that we will, those leaders will, and we, as citizens will place more emphasis on the importance of the movements they inspire. And I think Greta and the young people that have taken up leadership alongside her have been good at that, have been very good at building a movement and reflecting, sharing their power with that movement. And I hope that there's more to come of that, because I think that is how change happens.
Did you feel optimistic after writing this about where we are now and where we're heading, given our history, or not? What was your kind of feeling after completing?
It definitely depends on the day. And I think one of my low moments last year was being stuck inside by the pandemic, and then being stuck inside by, just literally, health threatening levels of wildfire smoke, and looking out the window and saying, this is not headed anywhere good. So yes, I don't want to suggest that I don't have moments of despair and pessimism, but I did feel more optimistic. But after writing this book, again, because there have been accomplishments, and also, I think about the work of people like Elinor Ostrom, who's not very well known in the conservation movement, but was a Nobel Prize winning economist who said, look, we have this idea of the tragedy of the commons, where we think of people as just sort of bound to selfishly pursue their own individual interests, and drain shared resources. We think of that as inevitable, but it's not. And we are not, I think her quote, what she said is, we are neither trapped in inexorable tragedies nor free of the moral responsibility. And so, yeah, we do have this, there are plenty of examples of the bison slaughter, one of the chief among them, of times when we have pursued individual gain to the detriment of our shared resources. But there are also plenty of cases where people have gotten together and pushed back against that. And so just knowing that it's possible for us to do better by other species does give me some optimism. Whether we're going to, as a global society, whether we're going to marshal the will to do that depends on the day. But the knowledge it's possible does keep me going. Yeah,
optimism levels, I that's familiar to me. They kind of wax and wane, don't they? Just, we had to wrap up in a couple of minutes, but I just wanted to kind of get a couple of questions from the audience here, and please do send through any now if you want to have them read, or forever hold your peace. Jean asks, could you say something about the relative importance of national parks in conservation or environmentalism, or any change over time? National parks, of course, hugely consequential in the US and then around the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, national parks are sometimes I think the phrase is they were America's best idea. And in some cases, I think there's some truth to that for sure. I think over the generations, it has become clear that the idea that people that other species need to be protected from people is just part of the conservation project. So drawing boundaries around highly vulnerable species so that they are not shot, their habitat is not destroyed. That is, I mean, it's certainly, been part of some of conservation's most important accomplishments. And I don't want to in any way take away from that. But I think it's a tool that we are recognizing now has its limits. And I think it became clear, as I said, when conservation went international and started trying to apply the traditional national parks model in developing countries, that it was often doing more harm than good. It was disrupting relationships that people had with other species, so that it was being, it was in some cases, displacing people, disrupting their livelihoods, and also not doing much to protect the animals themselves, because you can draw a boundary, but all boundaries are porous to some extent. And if you don't have the support of the people living around the park, a boundary doesn't mean much. So I think it's not, national parks in many cases are not, we as the conservation movement, it's neither practical nor desirable to establish parks everywhere we want to protect species. What we need to do beyond parks is support people in living in sustainable relationship with species. So if those species are part of human livelihoods, we have to support people in sustainably making them part of their livelihoods, and not
right
destroying those relationships, but in making them so that they can support both people and species. And I do think that's, that may sound like, this sort of impossible win-win situation, but I've seen it in practice and I know that it can work.
Right, because that was kind of the issue previously, wasn't it? That people indigenous to the area were kicked off the land, and then we tried to create these kind of living museums almost of areas that can't be touched or kind of worked in, and that's not practical in certain places. Where I'm thinking about Democratic Republic of Congo, for example. If you're going to protect the mountain gorillas, there are people who are living very close to there, and they're trying to make a living and survive, and you can't just simply evict them, because then that will then perpetuate the cycle of destruction in some respects.
Yeah, I mean, people are just, in my reporting around the world, my observation, and this is certainly not an original observation, but I have been reminded over and over again that I think people do care about other species, that they, especially the species they live alongside. If you gave someone a truth serum, they would not, and said, hey, do you want those gorillas to go extinct? People would say, no, I grew up alongside them. I like, I appreciate them, even though they can be a pain in the neck, I appreciate them. And, but if people don't have a way to survive, they are going, they will in many cases be driven to harm even the species they appreciate. And if those burdens can be relieved to some extent, then I think that natural desire to people are quite willing even to make sacrifices or to go to trouble to protect species, but they have to be able to support themselves and their families. So I think we can all understand that.
There is a related question here from Skip Keith, who says, isn't there an intrinsic conflict between humans and the good of the earth as an entity? I suppose you kind of covered a little bit of that there, but
yeah.
I mean, are we just a plague upon the world?
Yeah, gosh,
maybe that's the rephrasing of that question.
Yeah, it sometimes feels that way, doesn't it? I mean, I mean, I sympathize. I'm going to push back rather hard on that idea, but I do sympathize with it. And I think that I think it's easy, when you're sitting in a traffic jam in Los Angeles, or you're looking at these photos of mountains of bison skulls, it's easy to be like, oh my God, humans. But I really think, I know, and there's so much evidence that we are the worst, but
pretty bad.
I think one of the things that came through to me from this book is that yes, all those things are true, but that we can also play a constructive role in conservation in a very significant way, and that we need to. I think the conservation movement, or the environmental movement, has gone too far in saying, there's plenty of people who have famously said things about how humans are a virus upon the planet, and I always want to say, well, who's going to join that movement? Like, that's, I don't know, I don't want to sign up for that. And
how do you fix things too? Who's going to fix the problem? If we're not, we have a capacity for empathy better than any other animal, don't we? And
exactly,
compassion.
And so I think we have to get over that gut reaction, which again I totally sympathize with, and I've felt myself. But we need to be like, yes, we're so horrible, but look at our capacity, look at our cleverness, look at the things we have done right, and let's remember that we can play a constructive role, despite what some conservationists have told us over the years, and we need to embrace that role and figure out how to fulfill it responsibly. Okay, well, on that upbeat note, I'm going to say thank you so much, Michelle, for that wonderful chat, and for the Virginia Festival of the Book for putting on this event. It's time to wrap things up, so thank you to Michelle and everyone who tuned in. Please consider buying Beloved Beasts from your local bookseller or through the links on vabook.org. You can also check out future virtual events and watch past events from the Virginia Festival of the Book at vabook.org also. So thank you so much, and we'll see you next time. Thank you. Thanks so much, Oliver, and thanks to the Virginia Festival of the Books. Thank you.